A big step towards making orbit in RP-1 is being able to get rockets to go further and further downrange. And this 3,000 kilometer downrange milestone contract is here to get me going in that direction. However, my current financial crunch is forcing me to get there without the benefit of researching more advanced technologies. As the team at Launch Complex 1 continues to perfect their use of the 3rd generation Aerobees sounding rocket, Launch Complex 2 is working out the kinks in their V2 rocket, with the goal of integrating the two together for a final downrange push. Let's get started. Just to quickly recap my financial situation, as a result of upgrading from RP-1 version 2 to version 3 2 episodes ago, I am currently in a deficit, losing money every day. This is because the program funding model changed, and I am receiving 0 program funding until the new model catches up. To save money, I have changed administrators and fired all the engineers in the hangar. My goal now is to finish off the remaining contracts of my current programs as quickly as I can, which will allow me to pick up some new programs, providing a fresh source of funding. Unfortunately, although I do have some more powerful engines unlocked, I can't afford the entry cost, so I'm going to have to more or less work with what I have. To that end, let's get started with some missions. This is the AJ10-27 sounding rocket, having just been kicked off the pad by the Tiny Tim booster, and is attempting to complete the contract Low Space Biological Experimentation, which requires it to lift 75 units of sounding payload to an altitude of at least 120 kilometers and return safely to the surface. This is my second attempt at this contract. Last episode, the inaugural launch of this rocket was spoiled by an ignition failure of the Aerobee engine, forcing the mission to be aborted. This time, however, everything seems nominal. Also aboard is the biological sample capsule loaded with fruit flies being exposed to the rigors of rocket travel. I also have temperature and pressure sensors aboard, each of which completed and transmitted all the remaining science that was available in near space. The rocket reached an apogee of 177 kilometers where it deployed its payload, which was subsequently recovered once it reached the surface, thus completing the contract. But it turned out this contract was still not done with us. After the completion of the previous contract, another with the identical title spawned, this time requiring 115 units of sounding payload to be carried to an altitude of 140 kilometers. Thankfully, this 3rd generation Aerobee engine is more than up to the task, reaching an altitude of 161 kilometers before deploying its payload so that it can be subsequently recovered. I hope you don't mind me plowing through these missions like this. I want to show you every mission I do, but I like to concentrate on just what's different from the previous missions. For instance, during the testing for this mission, the KOS script that flies the rocket began misbehaving, blowing right by this wait until line that should have had the program pause until the rocket reached its apogee. Instead, the program simply continued on and then ended, shutting off the engine only a few seconds after launch. I spent a lot of time trying to puzzle out why this was suddenly happening, but in the end, adding a simple wait 1 second command ahead of the wait until solved the problem. In KOS, sometimes a stage command can cause the program to skip the next line. A simple wait often fixes this issue. Either way, this turned into the second successful flight of the AJ10-27. Up next came the unlocking of the early solid rocket engines tech node. This provided me with a collection of separation motors, definitely something that will be useful later, and a brand new SRB, which was featured in the very next launch. Okay, so we're back here with the AJ10-27. A couple of changes. You can see it's on a bit of a slant. I've slanted it to the north and a tiny bit towards the west, and the idea is for the temperature scan to helped pick up some of those high atmosphere shores science. So that is that. It still has the biological sample aboard, so we'll be collecting from that. It's still got the parachute we're going to recover. But there is one tiny little difference here. I have retired the Tiny Tim booster on the bottom here. Instead is the Aerojet 2.5 KS-18000. A lot of numbers, so let's see what this thing will do for us. It does look good, but a little different. The thrust dies off. You can see, if you notice that, there's that decaying of the thrust just before it stages. There are more residuals left behind with that particular booster, so I did have to change the smart part percentage to when the staging happens. It stages when there is only 10% when there's 10% of the resources left in the booster, which is more than what was on the old Tiny Tim. But I did find that got a little bit more altitude out of it when going straight up. A little over 20 kilometers of extra altitude at the end. Cost-wise, about the same. There was $5,000 to unlock the part, or 5,000 Kerb bucks. But otherwise, probably, I'm hoping, a worthwhile investment. At least it changes things up a little bit. Anyway, this rocket ended up reaching an apogee of 198 kilometers. But there is no more temperature science to get above 140 kilometers, so I decided I'll tilt the next one further over so that it will spend its entire time in the atmosphere. And perhaps avoiding bombing Savannah would be nice too. That one went up less than a month later, and although I was happy with its 117 kilometer maximum altitude, it was aimed too far eastward, spending much of its time over the water where I had already collected all the temperature science. Regardless, the high atmosphere temperature scans had to be put on hold for a bit, as I have another contract for this rocket to perform. I do love watching that SRB. This time we have another optional contract, Altitude Sounding Rocket Difficult, which requires us to get 75 units of sounding payload to an altitude of 130 kilometers. And if that sounds a bit familiar, it is because this rocket's predecessor, the XASR-2, completed the intermediate version of this contract last episode, where it only required an altitude of 80 kilometers. Recall that the rewards for these types of contracts build over time, but reset to 0 each time they are completed. As that XASR-2 launch was 8 months ago, the rewards have had a chance to build up again. The successful completion of this contract got me 37 reputation and 175 confidence. Recall that confidence is the currency you spend to acquire new programs, something I hope to be doing soon, while reputation increases the subsidy you receive, which right now is very important given that it is my Space Center's only source of funding. And while we are on the topic of reputation, as Launch Complex 1 was pumping out all these sounding rockets, Launch Complex 2 was busy integrating another V2 rocket, which was ready soon after this payload was recovered. Specifically, this is V2 number 3, which saw its inaugural launch last episode, but this time is set up for another of these optional contracts, Downrange Distance LV Development Difficult. I believe this guy will also crack the uncrewed altitude record of 250 kilometers, but the main one we're going for is to get 240 kilometers downrange with 500 units of sounding payload. So right up here is the 500 units of sounding payload tucked up there. I still do have the film camera on here because we can collect some film camera science and photography science as well. The rest of this reach an altitude of at least 140. As I said, I am aiming to crack 250 and get the 240 kilometer downrange with this. So we'll open up McJeb and our ascent guidance, and then we'll close that. So what's nice is it does leave it. It's always left on the settings that you last have it at, which is really nice. But it is nice here for me to be able to look and say, okay, 300 kilometers, yes, that's right, whatever our current inclination is. And then I actually did edit the flight path a little bit. Here, The turn shape should be 75. It is, and the final flight path angle is 0. And that is that. Okay, and we'll talk about, yeah, so I can actually, don't need to see that. No. So, according to this, we need to engage the autopilot. So, autopilot engaged, and we need to run V2 number 3 program. And hopefully, I don't need to do anything after this. Off. And again, what I so like with KOS and automating these missions is, you know, when you're bouncing around and you're building these things in the past and doing other missions, I always end up losing track of what my whole... Oh no, we have a launch failure. We have a launch failure. That is not good. Oh, poopy pants. Well, they happen. We best abort. So, boom. Ah! That's going to set things back a bit. That is an expensive loss. Now, I do have an identical rocket to that one, all set to be integrated. My hope was to modify and integrate it with the AJ10-27 to see how far the two together could get me downrange. But I really want the reputation from that optional contract, so I decided to let another V2 number 3 get put together as is, while I continued with the AJ10-27s being pumped out by Launch Complex 1. I got 3 more of these launches left to show you, starting with a rare night launch as I was still frazzled from the V2 failure and forgot to time warp to sunrise. You may have noticed I used an extra launch clamp on this one. That was because I was tilting this so much that the thing started falling over. Anyway, this is another rocket after high atmosphere temperature scans over the shores. The next launch was straight up, to finish off the collecting of the biological sample science from near space, and while it was at it, it stole the 250-kilometer altitude record that would have belonged to the V2 had it launched successfully. The final launch was another tilted over one, where I finally had its direction and launch angle dialed in enough to have its upper atmosphere path entirely over the shores. In fact, it finished off the upper atmosphere temperature scans, and once this flight was completed, I was at a loss as to what else to do with these rockets. The final 2 contracts in the suborbital rocket research program require the use of the advanced biological capsule, a part too big for these Aerobees series rockets. And with Launch Complex 1 having a maximum tonnage upgrade of only 3 tons, I couldn't see what this facility could do for me anymore, so I fired the 17 engineers that worked there and even went one step further and dismantled the launch complex. This left Launch Complex 2 and the V2 as the only game in town. Just a quick reminder, the contract here is to take 500 units of sounding payload 240 kilometers downrange. Although the contract doesn't require it, the plan is to separate and recover the payload, as I also have the film camera aboard, which requires it to be returned to the Space Center in order to collect the science. This is still, by the way, on the A4 engine. There is the improved A9 version that I could upgrade to. Again, lack of funds is really what's preventing that from happening. Lack of funds is preventing a lot of things. But even though I'm still on the original A4 engine, as this rocket was approaching its apogee, there we go. So that contract is now complete. We can get rid of that. Here. Take off the time warp. We can get rid of this. And how much confidence did that give me? That should have gave me a 715 confidence as well as 150 reputation. So that's exciting. All that's left is to recover the payload and collect the planetary photography science, which, by the way, completes the collecting of this science over the water in both the upper atmosphere and near space. As the people that have been following this series know, I love using Kerbal operating system to automate these missions, but I think it's worth reminding people that KOS is not part of the RP-1 package and is in no way necessary for these missions. I just find it fun, and I hope many of you do too. Anyway, after the mission was complete, I had me a total of 416 reputation. Here, let's take a look at the budget screen. Like, I'm receiving almost 100,000 in subsidies. If I did not receive that, I would be like so dead. But what I really need to do is see if I can get me that 3,000 kilometer downrange contract. The first step was stripping down both rockets. No more science, decouplers, or parachutes. I put the AJ10-27 with the Aerojet booster into a subassembly. Then, on the V2, I increased the diameter of the top of the nose cone to 300 millimeters so it could accept a 300 millimeter hollow interstage. Like that. And then, really simply, that's going on top. And that is a rather insane rocket. And all I want, one, will it fly? Two, how far will it get? That's what I'm interested in. So this is AJ V2 number 3 with the A4 on it. And then on top of that is an AJ10-27. The next step in this is modifying the KOS script for this new configuration. So I took the old V2 number 3 program and saved it with a new file name, Downrange. Now I need to look through this and see what needs to change to make this work for me. It is going to go through the countdown. That should be the same. Lock to prograde is going to be changing to... See, this is what's really nice, is this noticing that the ship, the thrust, remember what this line does? It detects whether you're the sudden drop in thrust. Specifically, it's looking at, does the thrust drop so that the thrust to weight ratio of the rocket's below 1? And the answer to that question is yes. What I used to do is use that as my opportunity to say, okay, I'm going to lock the prograde, I can go in coast mode. But now what I want to do is launch the next rocket. So this is going to actually turn into a stage Aerobee. Very specific. So this is going to be the same. And I'm going to change this print statement to staging. And this is going to be gone. And this is just going to be a stage command. And that should be the Aerobee off. That means that here, instead of lock to prograde, is going to be stage Aerobee. Deploy payload. There is no deploy payload, so I'm just going to delete that. Yeah, we're going to say the program is complete at that point. Let's see what this does. Let's see what this does for me. Okay, so we're going to engage our autopilot, and we're going to run oh, there's two here. Oh, of course there's two. There's two because there's two avionics packages, both of which have a boot file loaded. I decided to put the boot file just on the V2 as that has the near-Earth avionics, which gives us our attitude control, and I gave this thing its first test launch. Now this is all wrong, we'll fix that later, but I'm going to run, engage the autopilot, and we're going to run downrange is what I called it. And we're going to hope for the best. Alright, well there's up. It's going up. What's nice about having the little Aerojet SRB in there is that it isn't subject to ullage like the Aerobee engine. So there's no problem waiting for the V2 to lose thrust before staging, which should be happening pretty soon. There we go. And what happened there? What happened was that McJeb disabled control and turned off the throttle. This was because the avionics on the upper stage is just a science core with no attitude control, and it seems McJeb doesn't like that. I could change the upper stage avionics to a near-Earth core, but that would involve tooling a whole new avionics package, which I didn't want to spend the money on, and besides, the upper stage didn't have any means of attitude control anyway. It just needs to keep the throttle up. I tried putting a lock throttle to 1 command in the KOS script, but it didn't work. I'm realizing during the editing of this video that this line should likely be after the stage command, not before it. That's something for me to try in the future, because here I ended up doing what was simplest and just press Z after staging to put the throttle back to full manually. With that solved, I noticed that the upper stage wasn't as stable as I would like. That was resolved by introducing some gyro-stabilization, spinning up the rocket like an American football shortly before staging. This, again, I automated, but I'll show you how I accomplish that when I fly the actual mission in just a little bit. Unfortunately, that seemed to have introduced a different problem. Why did we not? What happened here? What happened here was a loss of ullage in the Aerobee engine. Once the SRB shut down, the propellants in the upper stage were free to float around, no longer being forced down into the engine. To prevent this, a smart part on the rocket was set to start the Aerobee engine when the propellant in the SRB was down to 10%. But apparently, that's too late now. The percentage needed to be changed to 11% for the staging to work. I have no idea as to why the sudden change. After this, it did just come down to tweaking the ascent parameters to maximize downrange distance, though I will mention just a couple of additional small things that came up for the benefit of those that may be following along with the build. One, there was way too much electricity in the lower stage and not enough in the upper, so I reduced the electricity in the avionics in the V2 from 800 kilojoules to 100 and increased the upper stage avionics from 58 kilojoules to 150. Also, throughout testing, I was using McJeb's flight recorder to track downrange distance, but also happened to have turned on gravity loss and drag loss. Even though I wasn't using the data, I just liked the graphs. However, something I didn't notice is that McJeb limits the amount of data that can be collected. And when this percentage reaches 100, all data collecting freezes. This threw me for a while, and I couldn't figure out why on some of the tests the downrange distance was suddenly so small, not even noticing that the number was frozen. Anyway, it's easy to deal with as you can reset the memory by clicking the mark button. Eventually, I did work out the flight recorder, and once I was happy with the rocket, and after a minor launch complex upgrade, I handed it over to my engineers to integrate. And it was while I was time warping to launch day that I received some very welcome information. It's going up! It's going up! Oh my god, it's going up! I'm in the positive! It's a celebration! Oh my god! Oh, I'm so happy. Okay, one thing at a time, but I am now in the black. I am back in the black. Let's open up RP-1. And I am receiving a program budget of $125,021. Oh boy, this should really opens up some options for me moving forward. But right now, it's time for V2 number 3 / AJ10-27 with the Aerojet 2.5K SRB. Let's take a closer look at the contract. Downrange Milestone 3,000 kilometers, which requires me to achieve an altitude of at least 140 kilometers and reach a downrange distance of at least 3,000 kilometers, and that's it. No payload, no recovery. What happens after 3,000 kilometers doesn't matter. And if I polish this one off, there's a similar 5,000 kilometer contract which will finish off the suborbital rocket development program. Also, if all goes well, this rocket should break the 500 kilometer uncrewed altitude record and a few speed records starting with this 3,000 meter per second one. Okay, I told you I'd tell you how I automated the gyro-stabilization of this rocket. The challenge is that McJeb wants to control the roll, and I would prefer it to do so until I'm ready to spin this thing up. I just need to take away its ability to control the roll at the right time. To accomplish this, I started with the control surfaces on the fins and disabled the roll entirely. I then activated the spoiler, which by default is toggled to the brake action group. Now, the A4 engine on the V2 is gimbaled, so McJeb will still have roll control. However, you can toggle the gimbal roll through an action group. So, on action group 1, I toggled the gimbal roll and activated the spoiler, making sure to remove the spoiler from the brake action group. I then added an Alt Pro altimeter smart part, which I set to trigger action group 1 at the appropriate altitude, which through testing I decided on 32 kilometers. And that was it. So you're going to see that happening in just a moment. There it goes. It's going to induce into a roll, and then when this engine runs out of gas, we're going to be engaging this one. There we go. We did the staging. And the Aerobees ignited. All right. You can see how the spinning is helping to stabilize this rocket, keeping it on its current attitude. All we have to do now is wait until that final engine runs out of fuel. Okay, let's see how we did. We have an apoapsis of 706 kilometers. That is breaking a record there. We broke the 3,000 kilometer speed record, so that is now gone to the wayside. We've also, if we take a look at our contracts here, we broke the 3,000 meter per second speed record, the 4,000 meter per second speed record, and the 5,000 meter per second speed record. So a lot of speed records bit the dust there. We're still going to pass 500 kilometers, as you can see, so that altitude record will get broken. All we need to do is make sure we get our 3,000 kilometers of downrange distance. We can enjoy a little bit of the scenery, I suppose. Let's time warp till we get to near our apoapsis. Getting close to our apogee now. Unfortunately, the North American East Coast looks like it's all under clouds, but you can't actually, if it weren't under clouds, see the Great Lakes and stuff over this way. And Nova Scotia you can see over there. To the south, oh, we can see there's South America, the top of South America there. We can see that. So that's pretty cool. Cuba is very, very prominently featured there. We're not going to be seeing anything of any other continents, unfortunately. We're not going that far across the Atlantic. Okay, let's just keep time warping. Okay, we're getting close on our downrange distance. We are getting close. I think we're gonna be good. There it is. So there we go. We did the downrange 3 kilometers. 3,000 kilometers. And the completion of this contract got us 32 reputation, but more importantly, there is only 1 contract left to complete this program, and 2 very similar contracts left to complete the other program. In addition, we are receiving program funding again, and although things are looking pretty positive for us, clearly this rocket is heading for a sticky end. In fact, at these speeds, things won't take long once we've re-entered the atmosphere. Oh yeah, tail fins have to go first. And delaying as long as it can. And it's over. As is this episode. I hope that you enjoyed it, and that I'll be seeing you again next time.